Quake, Disaster in San Francisco, 1906. Chapter 4. Aftershock. Jacob sat up, startled by the quiet. After the deafening roar of the earthquake, the absence of sound was eerie. The silence around him was so complete he could hear the pounding of his own heart. Then somewhere far off in the distance a child began to wail. Jacob stood up, wiggled his head from side to side, and flexed his arms and fingers. He didn't feel pain anywhere, so he decided that he wasn't injured. The dog looked up at him and wagged its tail, and Jacob bent down to brush the dust off its face and whiskers. The air had a peculiar bluish-yellow tinge that made everything seem unreal. The produce district lay in shambles. Piles of dusty rubble littered the street, and some buildings had completely collapsed. Others looked ragged where large chunks of wall had fallen away. Railings dangled off balconies, and the cobblestone street was twisted and pitted. Jacob felt like he'd stumbled into the middle of a nightmare. Lots of people were on the street. Some fell right to work, righting carts and gathering spilled merchandise, but others wandered aimlessly. Jacob saw one man wearing a nightshirt and walking with a slight limp. He wore a shoe on one foot, but his other foot was bare. A gray-haired woman held a small dog wrapped in a blue shirt. Several people clasped blankets around their shoulders. Others carried boxes. A woman bumped into Jacob. Her hair hung in disarray, and her face was smudged with soot. She carried a baby on one hip, and a small child clutched her skirt. The woman stared straight ahead, but Jacob was sure she hadn't seen him. When she stumbled on a fallen brick, she didn't even look down. Her eyes seemed fixed on something far away. Nearby, Jacob saw two heavy-set men pushing with their shoulders against the side of an overturned wagon, while a third tossed aside sacks of onions and pieces of wood. Moans came from under the wagon. At last the workers uncovered an old man wearing an apron. He struggled out, grasping his left arm with his right hand. His shirt sleeve was torn, and blood oozed from a nasty gash on his arm. Everybody avoided the sides of the street where debris had fallen in huge piles. Glancing at the buildings, Jacob wondered if any more were going to collapse. He, too, moved toward the center of the street. The dog began to bark, a high, excited sound. Jacob followed the dog down the street and saw a horse stuck in a ditch in the street. Only the horse's head and neck were visible. The poor animal's eyes bulged, and a froth of saliva dripped from its mouth. Jacob hurried to help it, but 4 or 5 men had already reached its side. "Would you look at this?" one of them announced. "Poor beast fell right into the crack. Must have gotten crushed. It's dead." The man shook his head in disbelief. Another man knelt beside the horse and looked into the gap between the cobblestones. The man whistled. "Holy Moses! I guess the street just opened up and swallowed it." The speaker turned to the others and used his hands to demonstrate. "Like a great big jaw. The ground must have opened wide and then clamped shut, squeezing the life right out of this animal." People crowded around to see the wonder, but Jacob backed away. He was beginning to feel sick. So much destruction and horror. He headed down the hill, glancing up frequently to be sure that nothing was going to topple down on him from a damaged building. At street level, the air was murky with the dust of collapsed buildings, but above the ruins Jacob could see the morning sun glistening in the clear blue sky. How can the weather be sunny today? Suddenly he felt a jolt. Another earthquake? He looked up at the people around him. Their eyes were wild with fright. Screams pierced his ears as the ground lurched and began to roll. Jacob fell to his knees and covered his head with his arms. The dog cowered against him. The aftershock was over in a few seconds, but it energized the street. All at once the dreamy mood of unreality shifted, and the entire area came alive with activity. People poured out of buildings, carrying children, bundles of clothing, and cartons. One man rushed by with a birdcage. All around Jacob, people hurried in every direction. For a second, Jacob lost sight of the dog in the crowd. "Here, fella!" he called frantically. When he heard a familiar bark behind him, he whipped around. The dog ran toward him and jumped up. Jacob buried his hands in the thick fur of the dog's neck. "Where should we go, fella?" Before the earthquake, Jacob had been heading for Avy's produce stand to return the dog. Now he hesitated. Should he walk back up the hill and search for his uncle? A feeling in the pit of his stomach urged him to keep walking downhill. More than anything else, he wanted to be home with his family. "Papa will be worried sick about me." Then another thought hit him hard like a punch. "Papa! What if Papa is hurt? Or Sophie?" Jacob began to run. "Please, God, make them safe." Jacob had to slow down to pick his way around the piles of bricks and boards clogging the streets. In places he scrambled over mounds of debris that completely blocked his way. People stood talking and pointing at the buildings, and Jacob had to squeeze past them. He mumbled, "Pardon me, excuse me, I need to get through here." Policemen were blowing their whistles and screaming orders. Horse-drawn wagons clattered down the street, their drivers yelling, "Make way for the horses!" One man glared at Jacob and hollered, "Move over, kid!" A wagon pulled to a stop in front of a large building. The driver jumped off and hustled up the steps and into an open doorway. Moments later a man emerged and helped a woman in a long dress climb aboard the wagon. Further down the street Jacob saw several men hoisting large trunks onto wagon beds. On Market Street the cable car tracks jutted out of the ground like mangled springs. Jacob threaded through twisted metal to get across the street. As he ran, Jacob passed a family pulling a child's wagon piled high with possessions. A little dark-haired girl followed her father, her thumb in her mouth and her face grimy. The girl's eyes met Jacob. She seemed so small and frightened. A vivid picture of Sophie filled Jacob's mind. He picked up speed and bolted around the family, the dog at his heels. When they reached the next corner, a policeman blew his whistle to stop them. The road was completely blocked by fallen bricks. Two other policemen were directing 8 or 9 men as they hauled the bricks off the street. Jacob saw a motor car idling on the other side of the pile of rubble. "Clear the way!" the policeman shouted at pedestrians. "We've got to get this car through." Jacob backtracked and turned onto a side street. He paused to catch his breath. "Where am I?" He knew he'd been heading in the general direction of home, but he hadn't been paying attention to landmarks. He decided he'd better stop running willy-nilly because he was beginning to tire. His mouth felt very dry. Hoping to spot something familiar, he scanned the fronts of nearby buildings. He was in one of those streets that always reminded him of a canyon, flanked with tall buildings on both sides. This street had to be part of the business district. All of a sudden, the dog came rushing at him, barking furiously. Why is the dog running toward me? Jacob wondered. He didn't even remember the dog leaving his side. Then he looked beyond the dog, and he felt like he was falling off a cliff. There, only a block away, a full-grown steer was stampeding down the street. "Look out, Sonny!" a voice shouted. A steer? Jacob stood rooted to the spot. Why is this happening? Who's yelling? A stab of pain snatched Jacob from his stupor. Something was snapping at his fingers and pulling at his clothes. He heard growling and glanced down. The dog was nipping at his fingertips. The steer was hurtling down the street right at him. Jacob wheeled around, leaped over a fallen chimney, and threw himself against the wall of a building. As if in a dream, he watched the dog scurry out from beneath the pounding hooves of the steer. Dazed, he watched another steer thunder by, then 2 more. Jacob heard shots ring out. He looked in the direction of the noise and saw 2 men with guns chasing after the cattle. One of the men paused and took another shot at the stampeding beasts. A steer keeled over sideways and hit the cobblestones with a thump. Jacob slid down the wall of the building and sat in a heap, his head in his hands. "You all right, son?" said a voice in Jacob's ear. Jacob turned his head. A middle-aged man wearing a black overcoat and hat was kneeling beside him. He looked like a well-dressed businessman out for a stroll. "That was something, wasn't it?" The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see a herd of cattle stampeding through the business district." Jacob just gawked, too stunned to reply. He felt as if a perfect stranger had strolled right into the middle of his private dream and started a casual conversation. "Good thing you had that dog with you," the man said. "I kept hollering, but I couldn't get your attention. I believe you would have been a goner if you'd stayed in the street." Jacob tried to concentrate on the man's words, but they all blurred together in his head. "Those cattle must have broken loose during the quake," the man continued. "The drivers were probably bringing them over to the stockyards at Portorero before everything went haywire." Jacob nodded, but he was not at all sure what the man was saying. The man sat down on a step. "Here, Sonny, I took the precaution of filling a jug of water before I left home. Looks like you could use a drink." When the man held out the jug to Jacob, the dog whined. Laughing, the man poured a little water into his palm. "Guess you earned a drink too," he said. Wagging its tail, the dog approached the man slowly and slurped the water from his hand. The man patted the dog's head. "That's all I can do for you, Pooch," he said. "Don't know when I'll get my hands on any more water." He held out the jug for Jacob. Jacob took a swig of water, then another. "Thanks," he said. "I don't know what I was thinking when I saw that steer coming at me. I couldn't move." He handed back the jug. "Where's your family, son?" "Don't know," Jacob replied. "I was in the produce district when the quake hit. I left my father and sister in bed this morning. I was trying to get back home. We live in a house south of Market Street." "One of those wooden boarding houses?" Jacob nodded. The man frowned. "I saw some folks coming from that direction. They said those houses were in bad shape. Some of them collapsed into a pile of sticks when the quake shook them. They said fires have already started down there. All the gas mains were damaged by the quake, you know." Jacob gaped at the man. "Look here, sonny, I wouldn't worry too much. Your family's probably fine. Folks have a way of getting through a calamity," he said, "especially in this city. Lord knows we've had our share of earthquakes. This morning's trembler sure was something, though, wasn't it?" Jacob couldn't sit still any longer. Every muscle in his body tingled with fear. He pictured Sophie trapped in the rubble and Papa frantically digging to reach her. He imagined curtains of flame roaring across buildings. "I appreciate the water, mister," he mumbled as he stood up. "I've got to hurry." He stood up, then grabbed the wall to steady himself. "You sure you're all right?" asked the man. Jacob nodded. "I'm fine, thanks." He stumbled into the street, the dog trotting beside him. Several people were bending over the huge body of the dead steer, but Jacob didn't go back for a closer glance. When his legs began to feel steady under him, Jacob picked up speed. As he ran, he pictured Sophie's eyes when she was scared, round and dark like pools brimming with fear.